breakout discussion and main discussion, then some announcements and the summing up. So yeah, Laura, do you want to make a start?
Yeah, thanks very much, Connie. Thanks for the invitation. I'd have liked to have been there in person, but I'm divided my time between London and Vienna this afternoon. And before I forget, by the way, we're actually parties in the process of writing a new pamphlet on trans. Some of us are involved in that, and hopefully that will be available to be launched at Marxism at the end of June. So meetings like this, I think, are really useful to sort of get some feedback or some discussion around the key issues for trans people and what's behind the war on trans. So I'll start with really briefly summarising what some of the real-term consequences are of the war on trans, because hate speech, misinformation and lies lead directly to discrimination, harassment, bullying and of course violence. Several of the recent consequences have been tragic and vile. I'm referring above all, I guess, to Brianna Key's murder in Warrington on the 11th of February during LGBT History Month, and that led to an outpouring of anger and sympathy expressed at dozens of large and angry vigils up and down the country. I'm sure comrades in the room were involved in attending some of those. I mean, that's not the only example of extreme violence against trans and non-binary people. In the US a week or so ago, trans sex worker and TV documentary celebrity Coco Dodol was shot to death in Atlanta. And Coco was the third trans woman to be killed there in recent weeks. And then back in late April in the UK, there was an arson attack on a flat in Whitechapel that comrades have probably read about, where two trans women and a gay man lived, and they barely escaped with their lives and were left traumatised. I mean, these are the incidents that make the headlines, but so much devastation of trans lives goes almost under the radar. For example, this was only really covered in the local press. Last November, 16-year-old trans man Finn Hall hanged himself in his bedroom in Keighley. How much was this caused by the pressure of trying to navigate transition in an increasingly hostile environment in this country, even though his family supported him? Other attacks are making life so much worse at the moment for trans and non-binary people. Gender clinics, including the Tavistock in London and Leeds, which deals with young trans people, the only one that does, are in turmoil due to the caste review that's taking place at the moment. There are major pressures on staffing and resources, and repeated attempts by transphobes to block the affirmative care that they're meant to provide. I mean, currently the situation is so bad that clinics are not making new appointments, and the reorganisation of the GIDS, the Gender Identity Development Service, that turns out to mean, this is according to a news report I saw or heard the day before yesterday, that only one clinic is due to open this year, with a second one next year. And this is completely inadequate, completely inadequate. All this means it can be a nightmare situation and seriously damaging to mental health, having to wait maybe 4 years or more for a first appointment, all the while having to deal in young people with puberty or risk going private if you have the funds. And of course, going private can disqualify you from future support from the NHS. So where are these attacks coming from? I think it's really important to remember that the attacks on trans rights and trans people's very existence are not based on any real evidence that they're a threat to cisgender women, but they're ideological, and they originate with the right and the far right. Right-wing religious and secular bigots, mostly in the US, quite consciously launched their attacks as part of the culture wars against the left. The culture wars read class war, of course. The right want to roll back what we've won on reproductive rights, same-sex marriage, anti-discrimination, anti-racism, and so on. And the more recent gains made by social movements like Black Lives Matter and Me Too that have established, for example, that the systemic and institutional nature of racism, sexism, and misogyny in capitalist society. That's not to say that there's not a minority of people on the left and among some feminists who've been sucked into hostility to trans people on the basis of misinformation, misunderstanding, and uncritical acceptance of the dominant ideology of gender binary and sex essentialism. Trans lives are a blind spot for them, and they justify their transphobia by seeing a conflict between trans rights and women's rights, which simply doesn't exist. This isn't new. In the 1970s and second wave feminism, there was a strand of trans exclusionary feminism hostile to trans women's involvement that tried to exclude them. It was based on the view that trans women were really, so-called men in drag, and this fitted with patriarchy theories' emergence at the time, and a sex essentialist approach that regarded all men as inherently violent and potential rapists. And we don't accept, as Marxists, such a profoundly mistaken and pessimistic view. Nevertheless, this was the view promoted by Janice Raymond in her infamous 1979 book, The Transsexual Empire, The Making of the She-Male. A report by her in 1980, just after the book was published, was used by private insurance companies in the US to deny health care to trans people for anything related to being trans, not just medical transition, but anything, including breast cancer or genital cancer. More recently, after Time magazine in 2014 published an issue with Laverne Cox, trans actor, on the cover, suggesting that we'd reached a transgender tipping point, was the phrase they used. These right-wing transphobes decided that trans people constituted a weak link in the LGBT plus community, and they could use attacks on trans rights as a wedge issue to split the movement and then roll back both LGBT plus rights and women's reproductive rights. Obviously, their attacks on abortion rights have been shockingly successful with the overturning of Roe v. Wade last year. Their first attempt to attack trans rights actually didn't go very well at all. Some comrades, I'm sure, will remember there was a bill in North Carolina in 2016 to ban trans women from women's toilets, but that was rescinded after there was a major backlash, which included a cultural boycott by figures like Ringo Starr, Bruce Springsteen, Little Steven, Cyndi Lauper, Neil Young, amongst others. Nevertheless, the US far right determined to press ahead with a new approach. There was a survey by CPAC, which is a horrible kind of right-wing coalition, Conservative Political Action Conference. They found that if they were to attack trans women's and girls' participation in sports and also try and block access for minors to medical transition, these were the most likely issues to play well with voters, and this is what they've tended to focus on since then. Donald Trump, of course, was a key ally in the White House from 2016, and it really wouldn't bode well if he does run again and wins, or if the horribly transphobic Florida Governor Ron DeSantis does, who seems to be also kind of a favourite potential candidate. The anti-trans US backlash from 2014-15 was then picked up in the UK a year or so later, when a group of trans exclusionary feminists started picketing meetings of the Women and Equalities Parliamentary Committee, who were conducting a study of trans people's lives in Britain. On the basis of that, they made over 30 recommendations for better health care and training and so on, but also recommended adopting self-ID to obtain a gender recognition certificate under the Gender Recognition Act. Self-ID, I'm sure comrades will know, takes the responsibility for formally deciding a person's gender identity away from the medical professionals and a faceless legal panel, and gives it to the trans person. It's an important step, a step away from the current pathologised and medicalised approach to trans people, and actually has been adopted so far in at least a couple of dozen jurisdictions around the world, including Ireland, with no reported violations or problems. But this was one of the triggers that launched various transphobic groups, which people will, I guess, be familiar with, Women's Place UK and others, and the kind of the reactionary movement of so-called gender criticism, headed up by some radical feminists, people like Sheila Jeffreys, Germaine Greer, Julie Birchall, Julie Bindel, Linda Bellos. And there's now a plethora of such groups, including the LGBT Alliance, who are very friendly with the Tory party, Women's Declaration on Human Rights, Fair Play for Women, and so on.
You've had 10 minutes.
Even more recently, how long, sorry?
You've had 10 minutes.
Okay, I've had 10 minutes or I've got 10 minutes. Both, I suppose, if I'm supposed to be doing 20 minutes. Okay, even more recently, celebrities like J.K. Rowling, with a huge Twitter following, jumped onto the transphobic bandwagon, and friends in the media and government have helped to propel the issue into the national spotlight, often under the false flag claim that such women are being silenced by a well-funded and influential transgender movement. Trans became an issue in the Tory party leadership campaign last year and contributed to the turmoil in the SNP, following the Tories blocking the vote to introduce self-ID to their Gender Recognition Act. So who are these people on the right? I'll tell you in a minute when I can turn over the page. Okay, in the US, major right-wing foundations and campaigning groups have sponsored and funded conferences, legal cases and speaking tours to promote trans hatred. The Heritage Foundation, one of those bodies, the Alliance Defending Freedom, the Women's Liberation Front, CPAC, Hands Across the Aisle, the World Congress of Families, and so on and so on. Many of these are extremely well-funded lobbying hate groups. It was actually CPAC that funded Posey Parker's recent Let Women Speak tour of Australia and New Zealand, that attracted big protests and even attracted a dousing. I think she got orange juice over her head, didn't she? And she cut the tour short and scuttled back home to the UK. What's really shocking, though, is that her tour attracted a group of Sieg-heiling neo-Nazis, which many in the gender-critical movement have failed to fully disavow, just as they failed to disavow anti-Semitic tropes and individuals like Jennifer Bilek. There was a journalist called Helen Joyce who published a book a couple of years ago. It's a nasty little transphobic book, in which she names 3 people that she claims fund the transgender movement. All of them, coincidentally, the ones that she mentioned are Jewish. And Jennifer Bilek has mentioned people like George Soros, Jennifer Pritzker, Martin Rothblatt as being behind some sort of transhumanist movement intended to erase women. I mean, these are figments of fetid imagination, but really nasty stuff, singling out Jewish figures. And as commentators have pointed out, driving anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, such as the Great Replacement theory, deep into anti-trans feminist movements. Their shameful political blindness to the involvement of the far right and fascist organisations really does constitute a dangerous entry point to the right's anti-woke, anti-working class agenda, opening the door to fascists who see trans rights as well as anti-migrant, anti-refugee agitation as wedge issues to attract a larger audience. So you had fascist groups like Patriotic Alternative, Hearts of Oak, and so on, been trying to shut down drag queen story hour events. They've been, claiming that they're examples of grooming by gender and sexual perverts intent on undermining the nuclear family. And I think it's fair to say that, and thankfully, they've had a limited success due to the large anti-fascist counter-protests that have taken place. We had one in Leeds a few months ago where, I think we had something like 300 to 400 turn out on our side outside the venue, and only about 40 to 50 of transphobic bigots and the fascists. We should remember as well, I think, that right-wing organisations and individuals who attack trans rights also attack women's rights. Another anomaly that many gender critics are prepared to ignore. It's not true that women's lives improve as the lives of trans people come under attack. In Hungary, for instance, Viktor Orban's right-wing populist government followed up its attacks on trans people by restricting abortion rights, banning gender studies at the universities, and declaring LGBT plus rights to be inimical to the nuclear family. In Russia, Putin's government has been attacking trans and LGBT rights for years, and his tame parliament, the Duma, now intends to declare feminism as an extremist ideology. In the US, the same right-wing zealots pushing over 450 anti-trans bills at state level that include permitting genital inspections of children playing school sports if they're suspected of being trans, or prosecuting parents of trans children for supporting their child, are also those celebrating the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade. They also want to ban or severe feminists, despite their claims otherwise. The vast majority of women's organisations offering support in areas like domestic violence and rape remain trans inclusive. Indeed, at least one of these organisations found itself being sued by gender critical groups because it employed a trans person. This in itself gives the lie to the notion that gender critics and transphobes are only interested in protecting women and girls. It comprehensively underlines the hypocrisy of their claim to be defending women's rights. In reality, their only purpose is to focus their ideological hostility and political energies on attacking trans people's legal and human rights and excluding them from social spaces that they've used for decades. They bring together people who may initially claim that they just have concerns or just want to debate or just want to safeguard women and girls. But as they become radicalised, their resistance to rational argument, their unwillingness to accept credible scientific evidence, and their ideological dogmatism, underpinned by sex essentialism and shared hostility to so-called gender ideology, tags them as a cult-like hate movement. Yet there's another side to this issue, and I'm kind of wind up on this, really, that despite the press and the media's willingness to uncritically showcase gender critics, we should remember that they've actually had limited impact on public attitudes towards trans people. According to surveys, like last year's large-scale More in Common study, attitudes to trans people remain broadly either supportive or non-committal. Even in the US, a recent Fox News poll found that 57% of the population are unhappy with the attacks on trans children. And what's been also extremely uplifting in recent times, and possibly, marked a shift, a really important shift towards the willingness of people, to go out on the streets and so on, has been the size of many of the counter protests in support of Drag Queen Story Hour. And this, by the way, isn't. And the vigils that took place in February as well. This is not restricted to the UK. The counter protests in Vienna on April the 19th drew over 1,000 people to defend the event against, this is a Drag Queen Story Hour event, to defend it against 200 assaulting fascists, Catholic bigots and members of the youth wing of the far-right Freedom Party. Trans people and their supporters are angry, and there's a growing willingness and urgency about building resistance to the onslaught. They know it's time to fight back. How should we try? How should socialists try to develop and shape that fight back? We don't start by weighing up who's more oppressed than someone else, as if there's a hierarchy of oppressions, but from a position of unconditional support for all the oppressed. We aim to be, as Lenin urged over a century ago, the tribunes of all the oppressed and exploited. We recognise that oppression in the capitalist system is endemic. The ideology of the nuclear family and the heteronormativity and gender binary assumptions inherent to it are why sexism, misogyny, homophobia and transphobia are so deeply rooted in capitalism, and why women's liberation, gay liberation and trans liberation require the overthrow of the system before they can be achieved. So we defend people's right to define themselves and their right to bodily autonomy. We say trans women are women, trans men are men, non-binaries an identity worthy of respect. We reject any claim that trans rights undermine or threaten women's rights. We reject sex essentialism and gender binary ideology as crude, simplistic, unscientific and anti-Marxist. And we argue that gender identity is a real material factor. It's as real as a person's sexuality. Being part of the united fronts needed to defend trans rights is an urgent necessity for socialists, for revolutionaries. Perhaps uniquely, and I'll finish on this point really, perhaps uniquely we argue within these for the active support and involvement of organised workers. Trade union blocks, banners and delegations on prides and protests are really important because they're based on the Marxist notion that the working class can be won to fighting transphobia and that the power of the working class is crucial in the fight to achieve trans liberation. We see what Marx called the totality of the capitalist system And hence the need for collective class resistance to fight oppression goes hand in hand with fighting the exploitation that we face in the workplace. And that also emphasises how crucial it is that we build an effective revolutionary socialist organisation, bringing together the oppressed and exploited to challenge the capitalist ruling class for power. And that is our purpose, and that's the path to building a socialist society. That's it. Cheers. Okay, yeah, thanks, Connie. Yeah, okay, right. And thanks for the points that people have raised. I think really important and interesting points. I'll try and pick up on a few of them in the few minutes that I've got. The comrade who mentioned the significance and importance of race in relation to transphobia is absolutely right. Of course, if you look at the figures of trans people murdered, we remember on Transgender Day of Resistance in November each year, something like 2/3, I think more than 2/3 of them are black or Hispanic trans women, and the majority of them are sex workers. And that, of course, is a class issue because, it's people who have no other means of keeping life and limb together but to engage in sex work, which, carries its own inherent dangers. You can see from that, the impact of class and the impact of race. And the comrade who mentioned, how dreadful the Tories' immigration policies are in relation, to migrants and refugees generally, of course, but particularly towards LGBT plus migrants. It's another example there, isn't it? But when we ask who's really putting women at risk, it is not trans women. It's not trans people. It's not non-binary people. I think somebody said the police. Absolutely right. The Met Police, the other police forces, but of course, above all, it's the Tories, isn't it? I mean, the Tory. We've had 10, 12 years, or whatever it is, of Tory austerity. Who has had who's had the burden of that? The main burden. Who's that for? And it's women. Women have had that burden in terms of being forced back. To care, more caring, rather than that caring being carried out by the state, etc., etc. The absolutely awful direct cuts on domestic violence refugees, something like 70% cuts since 2011, 2012 on domestic violence refugees. That's who's damaging women and girls. It's not, it's not trans women. Secondly, where's my second? Yes, secondly, somebody raised the question of what do we do about the guidance that is almost certain, I think, to come out from the Tories. I mean, in relation to schools and teachers and what teachers and schools are going to be so-called required to do. I mean, this is going to be an election point, isn't it, for the Tories? The Tories are going to go big. The more in the shit they are, the more they're going to try and focus on a scapegoat. Obviously, migrants and refugees, but also, trans and non-binary people. What do we do about it? I think we have to actually fight for our unions to refuse to abide by that guidance. That seems to me, I mean, not just to kind of meekly accept it in the schools, but just say no. Challenge the government, challenge the guidance. And sort of take up the issue. And if the schools and teachers are penalised for that, because actually what the schools and teachers would be doing is safeguarding the children, the LGBT plus children, then, they have to be thinking about taking action to defend their position and overturn it. So, I think that's, it is like to come. We really have to fight that. The comrade quite early on talked about, is it the fault of straight people? And I think a number of comrades came back on that, pretty well. We just need to remember, I think, that it's not. This is not down to kind of individuals in society. Marx talked about, the dominant ideas in a society are the ideas of a ruling class. It's the ruling class ideology that is the problem here. It's not the people who are haven't yet questioned that ideology, if you like, or accepted elements of it. We have to focus on, where does the power lie, and how do we challenge that power? And actually, the truth is, there are lots and lots of straight people, probably most straight people actually, who support LGBT plus rights. More and more people know trans people actually, and that has an impact. If you know somebody, it can kind of change your view. And it's quite clear. People said, the origin of the attacks is from the right. It's from ultimately it's from the top in society. It's used. These attacks are used to split our side, to divide us, to make us less, coherent in our resistance to what the ruling class, the Tories and so on, are doing in terms of attacking our currently massive attack on our standard of living, with pay cuts and so on and so forth. And it's their media which pushes this. It's not kind of, straight people themselves. Okay. Yes, Sheila raised some interesting points. I made the point about how, people who still regard themselves as feminists seem to have made a real volte-face from the position of the early 80s, which was, I don't know if people can remember it, it was, the slogan was biology is not destiny. Quite right, biology is not destiny. It was, it's a progressive slogan. And actually what they're now saying in relation to trans people, those who accept biological essentialism, sex essentialism, are saying, well, actually, biology is destiny. That's what they're saying, and it's a complete overturning of a progressive position, if you like, from second wave feminism, and it's really quite shocking how people have fallen into that. Right. Thirdly, the question. Sheila also raised the question of sport. A couple of people have come back on that really well. I think. I mean, the issue, the problem is that it becomes in the media and so on. It becomes all about testosterone levels, doesn't it? And what can be the appropriate level, and it ignores all the other factors that affect people's performance. Training. Whether you're a Kenyan long distance runner born in the mountains who carries more red blood cells and more oxygen and therefore can have more endurance in long running. Whether you're born like, was it Michael Phelps, with sort of enormous plate-like feet, that could propel him through the water, and this was kind of an accident of nature, really, birth. All these other factors. But they focus specifically on the kind of testosterone levels. It really shouldn't matter. I think somebody said this. It really shouldn't matter. It's not the case, actually, that trans women, and that's mainly who we're talking about here, trans women, have been phenomenally successful in competitive sports. They haven't been in terms of when they're up against top level cisgender women athletes. It's just not the case. And I think we have to that's the kind of way we have to argue this. And this is it's a transphobic approach to the whole issues. Where are we? Yes, I did want to just pick up on one of the. I haven't got time to do this. So I did attempt to come up with a definition in the book of gender identity, which is quite complex, and there's a level of fluidity to it as well. I think I did try to come up with that because I would argue strongly that it is a material factor. And there are people on the left who regard themselves as Marxists, it's not a material factor. Material factors are material things. You can get hold of them. Actually, that was not how Marx and Engels thought of material factors. There are things which actually impact, our lives in all sorts of ways, like sexuality, for instance. Sexuality is a material factor in our lives, as is gender identity. So I think we should have no truck with people who say, well, either gender identity doesn't exist, or that somehow it's not a material factor in our lives. And the final thing, because I'm obviously running out of time here, is coming back to the question of somebody raised the question of voting and who do you vote for. I feel for you. It is an issue. We are going to be faced with this issue in the general election coming up. I suppose one of the arguments is, that we put really, which is you kind of vote for the least worst option, don't you? I mean, we've tended to call for a vote for Labour with no illusions and so on. But you kind of vote for the least worst option. But the bottom line here is, of course, that socialism will not be won through voting. Or at least not through voting for parliamentary candidates. It will not be won through Parliament. We argue very strongly against that kind of reformist notion that everything needs to be focused to the, on the parliamentary road and so on. We argue that it's, direct action, it's mass movements, it's strikes and so on. These are the things that change people's consciousness. These are the things, standing on a picket line next to somebody who's gay or somebody who's trans, and knowing that you share a common enemy in the boss or the government who's trying to take away, your pay or your conditions or your pensions or whatever, actually massively undercuts, the kind of prejudices that people might well hold in general. This is what we learn from things like lesbians and gays support the miners, the experience there of the solidarity that they brought. So that's what's happening now with the strike movement is very, very important in that respect, because people change during those strikes. People's accepted ideas are challenged, and that's where we need to focus that out. And that raises the core question. I mean, Connie at the end there said, look, we've got trans pride coming up and so on. We have to fight, I think, really hard. And I do think we're probably kind of unique in this. We have to fight really hard to get trade union banners, trade union delegations along, to unite the fight, if you like, the fight over oppression, transphobia, homophobia and so on, with the fight over exploitation of our labour power. Unite those, and build the sort of movements that can really, challenge and roll back the attacks on us, both in terms of our living standards, but also in terms of how they're trying to divide us. Whether we're LGBT plus, straight or black, white, or whatever. That's how we do it. That's how people change. That's how we do it. And the SWP, I think, has a really crucial role to play in the disputes that are happening, and really crucial role to play in bringing together the fight, into united fronts to take on the oppression that we face. And I would hope that anybody who's not in the party would think about seriously joining that fight.